What's up, guys? Welcome back. John Levesque here, your host, joined by Matthew Farmer and Kent Weir from the Power Virtual Agents Cat team. Say what's up, guys. Go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody real quick.
Hey, I'm Matt Farmer. Nice to see you.
Hi, my name's Kent Weir. I'm a PM on the Power Cat team. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, so we had originally planned that we were going to talk to you today about topics. Topics is a very central part of building virtual agents, but we ran into a couple of scheduling snafus, and in the interest of keeping the show going for you, we said what we're going to do is actually just come back to that in episode 3. So Kent agreed to come on today, and Kent, what are you teaching today?
So we talked about last episode, the ability to extend your Power Virtual Agents chatbots using technology such as Power Automate. And so what we're going to talk about today is 5 tips on how to best extend your Power Virtual Agent chatbot using Power Automate, another technology that's near and dear to our hearts.
It's 2 of my favorites. I love this. I love this. And I like how you went with top 5 tips. Very TMZ headline, Kent. I like it. All right, so why don't you, yeah, exactly. Bring the fun. Go ahead, share your screen, man. Let's jump in and show the people how to extend their virtual agents.
Sounds good. So this is going to be a combination of slides and then demos just to make it real. So yes, as the slide says, 5 tips when extending Power Virtual Agent chatbots using Power Automate. So tip number 5 is exception handling. And so what we often find is that some folks might be new to Power Virtual Agents and actually new to Power Automate. And so for some folks that have been doing a lot with Power Automate, this is something that you might already be doing inside of your flows, which is great. But when you're new to Power Automate and new to Power Virtual Agents, you might not be aware of how you would go about handling exceptions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use try and catch scopes and configure run after settings to detect when we have an error and then be able to properly handle it and send the response back. Now, why do we want to do this other than it just being good practice is that if you don't catch exceptions and handle them inside of your Power Automate flow, what you're going to do is essentially get an unhandled exception being thrown back to your chat canvas, and your end user is going to wonder what the heck just happened and why do I see a very technical error. So the whole idea here is wrap your functionality, your core functionality in a scope, and then catch exceptions and provide a user-friendly error message back to them. So let's go ahead and let's just see a demo of this in action. So what I've got here is I'm now in the Power Virtual Agents Maker portal. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on tip number 5, which is going to generate an exception for us. And so all I'm going to do is it's the typical divide by 0 issue, but it's the simplest way to demonstrate this. So I've got a topic here, and I'm going to prompt for 2 numbers. I'm going to send those 2 numbers over to Power Automate Flow, and then what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually return the result back to the chatbot. So I can kick off this flow by just using a trigger phrase, and in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and use errors. And when life is good, I can go ahead and say I want to divide 10 by 5, and I get 2, and life is good. But what if someone wants to mess with me, mess with my flow, mess with my chatbot, and divide by 0? And so in this case, what I can go ahead and do is basically go ahead and call this flow, and then I'll show you exactly what you should be doing. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to have a handled exception, right? So in this case, an error has occurred. Please try again. Now, this is going to be essentially a stock message that I've gone ahead and constructed inside of my Power Automate flow. But naturally, you can go ahead and basically be more specific on specific exceptions. So what I've got here is I've got my trigger that has 2 number inputs, which you did see. I am going to declare a couple variables. One is to store my result, which is going to be of a type float. And then I'm going to have a string variable called flow status. And this is the variable that I'm going to set when something goes either good or bad. And so here I'm always returning this specific variable back to the chatbot, but depending upon whether or not I've got a successful execution or an execution that has an error, I will then return this variable. So here's where we're going to go ahead and perform our function. We're going to divide number 1 by number 2 and store it in the result. And when life's good, I'm going to have a result that I can return back as part of my flow status variable. But if I actually have an exception, what's going to happen is this catch block is going to be executed, and here I've got that hard-coded value. Now, a scope is something that you can go ahead and find when you add an action by just typing in scope. And for the try scope, we're going to just leave it untouched. We're just going to add our specific actions to it. But it's really the catch where we need to pay attention and do something here. We add a scope much like the same way. But then what we go ahead and do is we click on configure run after. And we need to go ahead and modify this behavior, right? So in this case, what we're saying is only run this scope, this catch scope, when our previous step, which happens to be our try scope, has failed, skipped, or timed out. And when that occurs, this will light up. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and call our return values action. And here we also need to make a change as well. And we want this action to run regardless, because what will happen is when everything executes properly, this is going to get skipped. But when we have an exception, this will run, and we need this specific action to run regardless. Now, just quite quickly, I just wanted to show you the behavior of this. So for the first execution, we're going to see life's good, right? We see a lot of green, everything is working. We go ahead, we perform our division, and then we skip our exception handler, and we basically return our values. Now let's go ahead and look at the last one, where we now see that we did have an exception when we went to go ahead and perform our division calculation. And as a result, what that did do is that then prompted our catch scope to be invoked, where we can go ahead and set that value. And then naturally, we're going to go ahead and return that back to the chatbot itself. And so what this allows us to do is have a handled exception so that we can craft a message that an end user is going to appreciate more so than a very technical error that includes conversation ID and things of that nature.
Yo, so wow. Okay, this is cool because like I never really thought about handling your errors through Power Automate, but I mean, two call outs. I think I have one shout out to building a calculator bot. That's pretty cool. And second to that though, this the try catch finally pattern being adapted to include virtual agents is just awesome. I think it's not even something I've considered. I don't think in any of the other bot tutorials I'm seeing, I don't think a lot of other people are considering this either. So very cool unknown tip and not very mainstream idea that I think has a lot of merit. Very cool.
I would definitely say this is kind of one of the most missed features with people using Power Automate. Don't realize there. It's like the thing people ask me about the most that you show them, and it's of course. It's like if you're familiar with programming, you know how to use it instantly, and it's very powerful when you know that.
Cool. Well, sounds like we're off to a good start.
Yeah.
So the next one is somewhat related, and it's I'm calling it fail fast. And so there's a reason for this. Whenever we have connections, and basically we're using actions through connectors, Power Automate has a default retry policy, which generally is a very good thing, right? So for example, maybe you're processing an email and you need to go ahead and call out to a downstream system. Maybe it's a custom API. And let's say you have an intermittent failure, just there's something going on with the network. Power Automate will go ahead and retry automatically for you. And there's a default retry policy, and you can see that on the screen here, where it'll retry 4 times and helps you address any sort of intermittent connectivity issues. Now, this is generally good when you have asynchronous processing, batch processing, but generally bad when you have an end user or a customer waiting for something to happen. And so once again, we don't want a customer to wait for retries to be going on when there's a system issue. We're better off letting them know right away that there's an error and that we're looking into it, because there's kind of nothing worse than a bot that you don't know what is going on. And so that's what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and change the default retry policy to be set to none, so that when we have a failure, we know about the failure right away. Because what we don't want to have happen is these retry policies continue to execute, but in the meantime, our client, our chatbot, actually disconnects due to a timeout. And so that's way worse than being able to say, hey, there's something going on, we're looking at it. And so that's what I'm going to show you here now. So let's go back to our chatbot, and I've got a separate topic for this. So this is going to be tip 4, and this is retry settings. Now, as part of that, once again, very simple from a Power Virtual Agent perspective, but then we're going to get into the flow itself. So let me show you the flow first, then we'll run it. It'll make more sense from that perspective. Once again, we're using try catch just as a good practice. And what we're going to go ahead and do here is we're going to take a look at our settings. And here we're going to have we're going to set this to default. So we're going to set it back to the default value itself. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and call this endpoint. And in this case, it's a custom API. It sits inside of API management. And I'm going to make this fail on purpose. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to basically violate a policy of too many requests. So in this case, if I go ahead and I run my bot now, what's going to happen is we're going to experience this timeout from that perspective. Let me just pull up my URL here. I could have hard-coded it, but now what's going to happen is the flow is actually going to go ahead and try to call that endpoint. And so API management is going to balk at it, saying, sorry, you've had too many requests. And so this is the behavior that you'll see in a chatbot, which is always really frustrating, especially once it goes ahead and it actually times out and fails. And so that's what we're going to try to avoid here is we're going to go ahead now and we're going to edit our flow. And in the flow itself, we're going to change the retry policy from default, and we're going to set it to none. And then what will happen is when we go through the same exercise, we will see an immediate failure that is returned, as opposed to having this timeout and waiting for roughly a minute before it actually goes ahead and fails. So let's just head back over to API management, and we'll just make sure that the rate limit has exceeded. Then we'll head back to our chatbot, and we will go ahead and we will retry. And let's provide the URL. And then here we can see once again, we've got a handled exception and that it failed right away, and that we're not actually seeing those 3 little bubbles floating saying, am I working? Am I not working? I'm not quite sure. And so that's why it's really important. And then just quite quickly is if we take a look at the original request, we'll be able to go ahead and see the actual retries. So here we can actually see that we had retries that were occurring. And what's happening is when these retries occur is we're blocked. We're now blocking the actual customer in the chatbot from actually doing anything because we're essentially in this holding pattern.
Yeah, I think I like this one because I really hated the second experience a lot less. Like when dealing with a bot and getting an error, I think there's nothing worse than just sitting there watching those 3 dots where I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, choose something, tell me something. Like, where's my next opportunity for input? And just getting a fail, an error happened, please try again. It's still, something frustrating to an end user, but so much less than sitting there waiting a minute to then be told that. And I think that that's really the key, right? Is if you can get the information to the person right away. If we know a pattern where it's going to fail, why sit there and make the person suffer for a period of time? Let's just go ahead and move on past it.
Exactly. And in this case, my API management policy is set for 60 seconds. So in sort of more practical scenarios, like that could be, 60 minutes. That could be 6 hours, right? So you definitely want to be protecting against those because you really will exhaust those retries and it will just flat out fail. What we did see here is that basically the window got reset, and during a retry, it did actually succeed. But yeah, like that is something that you want to be mindful of when you're building out your flows.
One other quick thing there, Ken, on the previous slide. I mean, you do call out on the slides there is the default retry policy is an exponential one, so it takes doubles the length each time you make the request. I mean, one other thing you can do is if like the back end is perhaps a little unreliable or a little slow, is change it to a fixed one. So that should reduce at least the amount of time. So that gives you a halfway house.
We could quickly retry, like for say 10 seconds, and have just one more or even two retries, just as a result. Yeah, no, I totally agree. That is a good point. There are a few different modes that folks can check out. All right, so now on to tip number 3, and this one was actually even new for me recently, and it's super important. Certainly, we've seen recently there have been some changes in terms of the entitlements available inside of Power Automate Flow. And certainly what some folks might run up against, depending upon their specific plan, is request limits, basically API request limits. And so what is super important, and it's called out here in the documentation in the docs, and we'll include this link in the description, is that when you are creating Power Automate flows, you should be using the Power Virtual Agents authoring canvas to create them. And so the reason for this is that when you click on this create a flow button, there is a specific template that is used behind the scenes to actually go ahead and provision the trigger and the response action. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to take advantage of the entitlement that you get with your Power Virtual Agents license, which here is 15,000 API requests per flow every 24 hours, which is huge relative to what a typical user might experience in a per user plan. And so the tip here is always create your flows from the Power Virtual Agents canvas. Like even though if you go ahead and you create a flow manually and you put a Power Virtual Agents request trigger and a Power Virtual Agents response action and you include it in a solution, you will be able to discover it. But what that means is you haven't actually created that flow using the right template. And so what that can do is actually draw from your per user entitlement as opposed to the entitlement that you're essentially paying for. As part of your license, you do get some entitlement to CDS, and you also get entitlement to premium connectors and these increased request limits. So really important, very simple tip, no demo for this, but you want to go ahead and use this approach. Is this something, John, that you are aware of?
I was not aware of this actually. And I feel like everyone who's watching this, you should probably rewind and watch that again, just so you're very clear. Like, that's crazy. I did not know that, and now I feel like I need to change some teaching. So I learned something here. You're training the trainer as well here, Kent.
No, cool. Yeah, no, this is something that, once again, the purpose of the show is we want to be able to share learnings that we've had with other customers. And this was a topic that recently came up. And so, yeah, it made perfect sense to go ahead and share this broadly so everyone is taking advantage of this as well.
Very cool.
Cool. All right. So on to tip number 2. And so this is kind of related to what we saw before with the retry policy. And this is don't unnecessarily block a caller. And so mileage will vary here, right? But the core principle is, when possible, return control back to your Power Virtual Agent chatbot as fast as possible so that the end user is not waiting. And so what this does mean, if there are actions that you can run after the response, you should go ahead and do it. And I fully appreciate that may not always be the case, but if there was ever some sort of like cleanup you needed to do, or send an email after the fact to another team after you've, say, created a record in a system, go ahead and do that after the fact. Sometimes people might, especially if they have a development background, they might think, they might look at the flow kind of like a function call, or I'm at the end of my function call, I need to return the results and that's it. But no, it works a little different. We can return a message back to Power Virtual Agents chat canvas and then do additional processing. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at this in action.
My gosh, Kent, you're blowing my mind. I feel like I'm learning so much. I'm making mistakes here. I do all of my actions before I return any values. And this is good stuff, man.
Well, and sometimes you have to, right? Like, so for example, like you might go ahead and make a request and you need to like insert, say, a ticket. You might be creating a ticket for a service desk. And naturally, as part of that response, you do want to go ahead and give them a ticket number. So in that case, you might have to wait. But in terms of notifying the team responsible for that specific area that ticket's been launched, that you can do after the fact. That you don't
Totally.
need to go ahead and do up front. So in this case, what we're going to do is here, we're going to just go ahead and type block. And I'll just show you this in action, right? So that was very quick. We go ahead and we, have this message that's just part of our topic itself, and then we see success being returned. Now, if we go ahead and look at our flow, it's going to look very similar to what we just saw in the PowerPoint itself. And this is going to be quite simple, right? Here, I'm only going and sending an email, but the point is I've already returned success back to the chatbot, and then I go ahead and send my email. So if we go ahead and look at the run history for this, we will go ahead and see that our response is set first, right? And then this took 2 seconds, right? So if we would have put this in between, we would have delayed our end user from getting a response for 2 seconds. And so every second counts when you think about a chatbot. Everyone nowadays, right? We want like just instant feedback, instant responses. And hey, if you can save 2 seconds, you should, because that's only going to make people want to use your chatbot more, not less.
That's a good one. I like this. I like this a lot too. It's just a quick tweak on how things are done, but it's funny because I tend to think of everything has to be done before I return to the virtual agent, and that's just not true.
Right. Yeah. And so think about what needs to happen before you respond back to the user and what can happen after. Okay, now here's the next one. And we do see this a little bit, and this is another one, especially when people are sort of new to both Power Automate and new to Power Virtual Agents, is dealing with loops. So we all know that loops are very much a part of Power Automate, and they're largely there to help, right, in terms of being able to process multiple records as part of a record set. And so sometimes they are naturally required, but if you can avoid them, you should. And so how do you avoid it? Well, naturally, you need to get at data. So one is using filters, so filtering data up front, so that you don't have to process records. And then another is using expressions, being able to go ahead and request, say, the first record of a result set when you absolutely know that that is where your data is that you're interested in processing. So let's just go ahead. Let's just take another look at this and head back to Power Virtual Agents. And this is our last tip number 1. And so what I've got going on here is I'm going to go ahead and query CDS. And I'm going to return a bunch of records back. And so what I'm going to show you here is more of the anti-pattern than something you should copy, but just to sort of illustrate the point. So what I've got going on here is I'm going to list records. And the records are, I'm going to go ahead and list accounts. Now, I'm putting in a top 15 here just because I have to, otherwise I get an error. But sort of the same message holds. Now, as part of the accounts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through each account and just go ahead and see if the name is equal to Contoso. And when it is, I'll go ahead and set a value of just here's the account name, and then here's the account ID. And I'll go ahead and I will return that back to our flow. And so just to show this in action, let's go ahead, let's type in loop, which is one of our trigger phrases here. This is going to take longer to process than it should. And I'll show you in the run history why, right? So now we've gone ahead and we've received our message here. And then here we've gone ahead and retrieved our account from CDS. Now let's go back to our flow. And let's just take a look at the execution history. So in total, this took 4 seconds to run. And so when we look inside of our try, we've listed the records, and that's 1 second. Now, what we were doing is we're looping through 9 records in this case. There's only 9 accounts in my system, but think about an enterprise system where you have thousands of records, right? And so what I'm doing is going through this 9 times and doing this check. And so that's not a good place to be, right? We're wasting all of this execution time looping through the record and performing this specific condition itself. And so the right way to go ahead and do this would be, in this case, and mileage will vary naturally, is we can go ahead and use a filter query. And in this case, go ahead and say name equals, and then basically our account name, and then run it like that. And then when we do that, basically we'll only retrieve one record as opposed to doing all of that excess looping. So once again, it all depends on the systems that you're connecting to, but wherever you can avoid loops, you should, because that just means execution time. And what you're doing is you're forcing the end user to wait. And naturally, that's the enemy here. We want to make sure that we've got the most responsive bots as possible.
Nice. Yeah,
sorry. I was just going to say, where this gets really scary is where you have calls that use nested loops, and where you see people really getting caught out because they assume it's, maybe they're a programmer and they've written this sort of thing that runs locally. It's not the same when you're running it in something like Power Automate. So you really got to be careful you're not doing, thousands of actions, even though you only see 2 loops.
Yeah, nested loops just compound the problem. They make it much worse. And the other thing is, we talked a little bit about your API limits. Whenever you have loops, now your API limits are going to be impacted as well, because for every time you go ahead and loop and perform this specific action, that now becomes an API call. And then we go ahead and do another call, right? When we set the value, that becomes another call, right? So these things typically start to compound. Now, the other thing you can think about here is sometimes if you are forced to do a lot of this sort of logic where you do have a lot of nested loops, that might be the opportunity to go ahead and to write, say, an Azure function or a custom connector and go ahead and be able to call that, just if you find that the performance will be better as well. So that's something to think about as well. If you have too much looping going on, is then think about maybe writing some code to be able to do that logic, and think about what is the impact to the end customer. In some cases, it might be worth it because you could reduce your execution time by 10, 15 seconds, which is huge when you've got someone waiting on the other end of a bot.
Yeah.
Yeah, classic example with something like that is, you have you get a bunch of stores, and then you go through the inventory for each stores, and then you make a list out of them. That, like you say, there's probably a more efficient way you could do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think one other way I find to break loops that's effective is select. A lot of people don't know about the select action, and a lot of times you can kind of create a key value pair from an array using select and just pick the key items you want, and then it avoids the loop because you then proceed with just the items you need. And so with first and a couple of filters and stuff, that select action is underutilized, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that is a good one. I totally agree. That makes sense. So that's it. That's 5 tips on how to extend Power Automate, or how to extend Power Virtual Agents using Power Automate.
Very, very cool. I am sure that people at home learned a whole bunch of things, because I even learned a whole bunch of things today. So, man, Kent, thank you for disseminating this learning, for boiling it down in such a teachable way that so many people can understand. Really appreciate this. This is awesome. We'll be back next week to talk about topics. We alluded to it at the beginning of the show that was our planned version. So our next show, we'll be back to talk about topics and Power Virtual Agents. So hopefully you got some great tips out of this. You can go on and build better bots that do more cool things. Go ahead and leave us a comment. Let us know what our next shows should be about, what things you want to see. Go ahead and click like and get subscribed so that you make sure and don't miss another show. That's it from us. We'll see you in the next one.